Despite being most well known for overcoming blindness and deafness through her childhood, Helen Keller's later life was full of accomplishments. She used her story to gain a platform, advocating for disabled people throughout the 20th century and across the globe. Her career centered around her mission to increase the quality of life for disabled people worldwide. Helen Keller was born without disabilities on June 27, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama, to Arthur and Kate Keller. At 19 months of age, Keller was afflicted with an unknown illness that left her blind and deaf. As a result of her disabilities, Helen became frustrated as a child upon the realization that her family communicated in ways that she wasn't able to understand. Ultimately, her parents had to seek professional help in order to address her disabilities in future. Upon traveling to Baltimore, Helen was referred to Alexander Graham Bell, who was working with deaf children at the time, and suggested they visit Perkins School for the Blind. It was there that the Keller family met Anne Sullivan, Helen's closest friend for most of her life. In 1887, Anne Sullivan began teaching Helen fingerspelling, a form of communication that Helen soon became fluent in. Her rapid knowledge and intellect led to an active academic life that took her to the Perkins School for the Blind in 1888, the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in 1890, Wright Humason School for the Deaf from 1894 to 1896. In 1896, she began attending Cambridge School for Young Ladies, a preparatory school for college, as Helen became determined to enroll at Radcliffe College, where she attended from 1900 to 1904 and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts, the first deaf-blind person to do so. By that time, she was also very fluent in multiple forms of communication, including Braille, lip touch, reading, and speech. In 1903, Helen published her first book, an autobiography titled The Story of My Life. Sharing her story allowed her to reach audiences across the globe and expand her platform for activism. Using the position she created for herself, Helen was able to advocate for several different causes, including workers' rights, women's rights, peace, and disabilities.
After her graduation, many people were skeptical of her education and involvement with the workforce because of her disabilities. But it was for that reason that Helen was determined to serve her community despite her disabilities. Helen got involved with the women's suffrage movement and workers' rights through the American Civil Liberties Union. During this same time period, Helen became more involved in politics and further disliked capitalism as she believed it contributed to the discrimination against the handicapped community. Her career as a writer increased people's awareness about her and her story, which allowed her to participate in politics. Her confidence as a socialist grew as the 1920s approached, when she spoke out about the growing presence of World War I and how it was a profit-making venture for military industrialists. Her belief was that more money was going towards the military than other appropriate areas of the United States government. After the war ended in 1918, Helen took a step back from politics to increase her involvement with the disability community globally, which she was the most passionate about advocating for. This led her to join the American Foundation for the Blind in 1924, which created an influential platform that lasted for over 40 years. By then, she had already appeared at 249 meetings in 123 cities. On behalf of the foundation, she traveled, raised funds, lobbied political leaders, as well as state and national legislatures. She visited over 30 foreign countries, and Eleanor Roosevelt called her a goodwill ambassador of the U.S. in 1928. The American Foundation for the Blind launched the Helen Keller Endowment Fund, seeking to provide a $2 million financial base for the foundation, which proved to be successful with Helen's involvement and public presence. Through the 1930s and 1940s, Helen devoted her free time from the AFB to fundraise for other organizations such as Palestinian Lighthouse, which provided educational and rehabilitative assistance for blind people in Israel, and the Lions, a philanthropic organization of U.S. men that devoted time and funds to assisting blind people internationally. She was also a lobbyist on the behalf of the AFB, in which she encouraged funding by state commissions for the blind. Helen's passion for advocating for blind people was influenced by Anne Sullivan, who had originally attended Perkins School for the Blind because of her own visual impairment. Through the 1920s, Anne had been struggling with her health, and in 1929, she had one eye removed as a cataract grew over the other. Anne had always believed that blindness shouldn't be a disability, but with her blindness developing, she became depressed and isolated herself from the public. Anne's death in 1936 left Helen to continue her career with their companion Polly Thompson, who had met the duo a decade after Helen graduated from college.
Following Anne's death, Helen was able to take on a trip to the Osaka Lighthouse, the primary school for blind people in Japan, and traveled to 39 different cities, giving almost 100 lectures. Helen found success in Japan, which was much needed after the devastation of her friend's death. She was able to convince the people that the handicapped community were capable and useful in society. Leaders of education for blind people planned to expand the Osaka Lighthouse by building another institution in Tokyo. With the rapid development of war in Asia, however, Helen was forced to return to the United States for her own safety as AFB canceled her tour. Helen found a lot of success in Japan and continued to have a passion for their disabled community even after World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked Helen as she had grown close to the citizens of Japan while traveling abroad. Unable to travel internationally to Europe due to the war, Helen concentrated the majority of the 1940s aiding veterans and visiting rehabilitation sites. The American Foundation for the Blind utilized her visits as a strategy to encourage everyone. The disabled community included that there was purpose and capability for disabled citizens. In 1948, Helen returned to Japan and was reminded of the purpose she had felt a decade earlier. Helen was determined to be an ambassador and encourage peaceful international relations while still advocating for women, workers' rights, and the disabled community. She was saddened by post-war Japan, but took the devastation and used it to encourage peace in the war-ravaged nation. It was during this time period that Helen had found her purpose after losing Anne, and concentrated the remaining years of her career to bring positivity and awareness to countries worldwide, including Iraq, Israel, Syria, and Egypt. By the time Helen retired to her home in the early 1960s in Connecticut, she had visited over 30 countries and lectured to hundreds of thousands of people. AFB, as well as the American government, encouraged her travels and the way she presented Americans. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This was just one amongst several awards that Helen Keller received throughout her lifetime. When she passed away in 1968, Helen Keller was one of the most famous American women of her time, who had brought change and reform to nations across the globe.